husband was going to be married to somebody else. And that way I would be sealed to both her and him in the afterlife.
Wow.
And this is something funny I found that I'm sure Masons today would probably hate to hear this. But before the first temple ceremonies were done, Joseph Smith met with Masons.
Yeah.
And some of the ceremonies and stuff that the Masons do inside their temple or wherever they meet,
Right.
those secret things, he incorporated
Mm.
into the temple. Have you ever seen one of the ceremonies inside the temple?
Mm-mm.
So this person, who I'm sure cannot reveal their identity, wore a camera on their clothes
Oh, really?
and went into.
Now, wait, is this the... Now, I've seen something like that when it comes to the Masons. I hadn't seen it when it comes to the...
So this is inside the Mormon temple.
Okay.
So it is so cultish that it would freak it. Like I would have a nervous breakdown.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting here watching it on TV, and one of the elders gets up, and they have to go through these certain ceremonies, and they have to memorize all this different stuff, and they go through place to place to place. Well, the final place is there's a veil, and there's an elder up there, and he takes the person up there, and the voice from behind the veil, it's like over I guess it's microphoned out. It has to be. It says, "Do you have the coin of the Aaronic priesthood with you?" And the person says, "Yes, I do." "Will you give it to me? And what is its name?" And the hand comes out, and the person places the coin inside the hand, and the hand goes back. And then the voice talks for just a minute, and then it says, "Do you have the coin of the Melchizedek
Priesthood, yeah.
Hand comes out again. They do a secret handshake thing like with their hand, and they give them the coin. And it says, "By this, I grant you the right to come into God's presence." And like the veil splits, and the person walks through that veil. Now what's behind that veil doesn't get to show on the video.
Yeah.
You do see the veil split, and the person comes through it, and then the veil shuts behind them.
It's crazy.
And the women, I don't know if the men go through this. I'm sure they may do it, but the women go through something called an endowment ceremony, where they're endowed to the church. They make certain oaths and covenants with the church.
Hey, Mr. Carl.
You've seen their undergarments, right?
I've heard, yeah, I mean, I've heard.
So, they don't. Well, actually, they can. So if they're working out, if they're swimming, if they're doing anything that's going to excessively cause them to sweat, they're allowed to take it off.
Yeah.
One of the girls that I watched the video on, she said, "Yeah, on days I don't feel like wearing them, I work out all day." Well, anyway, and she says I can't reveal what the garment looks like. So they show them in packages, like, "Hey, this is what I have. I have 10 sets of these, and this gets me through the week," and goes through all that. And but there's certain symbols, like when they go through their endowment ceremony, they get baptized for the dead, or they do any of this stuff. They get certain symbols put on there, and they can't reveal that to anyone.
Yeah.
So in the originals, they
It's
don't
like
do this.
Power Rangers.
Yeah. They don't do this part anymore. They used to do the whole ceremony naked.
Oh, my.
So they would just be naked right in front of the elders and all them. And then they had to make, one of their oaths and covenants was they would stick out their tongue and act like they were cutting her tongue off. And if it was a woman, she would act like she was cutting her breast off. And then she would do the motion like she had split her stomach and her bowels would come out.
Good night.
And they would take a covenant, an oath, to say if they ever revealed the secrets of the temple or went against the faith of the Book of Mormon or the testimony of Joseph Smith, that they would do these things to themselves.
They're totally part of the world order. I have no doubt. If they're a satanic cult, I have no doubt.
Yeah, yeah.
Here's the scary part. Like most of the teachings and all these things, your average Mormons have no idea.
Oh, yeah.
And actually, most of your missionaries
Yeah.
like have no idea about the church history because what happened to the Mormon belief was when, like, this is what I found. So when the age of the internet come out, a ton of people left the church.
Yeah.
Because you've heard of the Book of Abraham? Like, that caused so many people to leave the church because Joseph Smith, you know, he's seen this thing, traveling guy. He had like this Egyptian big old stone that was traveling around. Well, Joseph Smith claimed that that was the Book of Abraham, that Abraham himself had written this. So this illiterate man pretends like he was writing it down, and the church buys it from him, by the way.
Yeah.
The church buys it. He takes it down and writes it as the Book of Abraham. Well, then, this is something cool I didn't know existed.
Yeah.
The Rosetta Stone.
Yeah.
I didn't know that existed. I just thought that was how, you know, people
Like the language program. Yep. That's why they named it that. Yeah.
So the Rosetta Stone shows up. And now people can...
They can actually interpret it.
Translate what the Egyptian language truly said.
It showed he was a shyster. Yeah.
And it was like a pagan funeral thing.
Yeah.
Is all, it had nothing to do with Abraham, nothing to do with those people. And the church had to admit this in the 1960s, that, yes, he was lying.
Yeah.
So they had to retract that. So whenever that information got out, a lot of people lost their faith in the church.
Yeah.
Or
That's
not
crazy.
church,
The Mormon, yeah.
Anyway.
That's crazy.
Hey, on the side, on a different note, got to thinking, you know, you mentioned this morning about, you know, a lot of people ask why God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And saw, you know, all the debates I watch, and it's something that I've always thought, you know, most people think. And the speaker had a good point that in those days, all the gods demanded, most gods demanded human sacrifice. And I believe what this guy said was God was asking him to do the same thing all the other gods were, but instead of actually sacrificing him, he saved him, and that was a form of, like you said, God's personality in the Bible is partial, you know, some of his grace. That was his grace differentiating himself from all the other gods. You thought I was going to do what all the other gods weren't, but I didn't. I'm a God of grace.
So we'll actually study that here in our first session, or the first part of our time together, because that is one of those passages that people really struggle with. But yeah, I mean, I've never heard that before, but that's an interesting take on it.
It makes sense because it matches his personality.
Yeah.
All the Bible, grace, and it just makes it.
Yeah, it's interesting.
That actually makes sense.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, let's. How about we pray and then we'll jump into it. All right. Yeah, let's pray. Father, I thank you for this day. Thank you so much for the opportunity to gather together. Lord, you are Lord of this place. Thank you for your word that you've given to reveal that lordship and that kingship over us and over all creation. And so, Lord, we just humble ourselves before you today, and we pray that you would guide us as we talk about these problematic issues that skeptics bring up with the Old Testament, and even things that we may struggle with as we're reading. And so, Lord, help us to be guides for others so that they can understand more about your faithfulness and your character. And we just thank you once again for your love, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so let's recap a couple things. We had our first session was about how the Old Testament was formed, a timeline of events, and the exclusion of the Apocrypha. Dealt with a little bit about what was in there and why it was excluded. And then over the last, kind of the middle two sessions, we dealt with the big theme of covenant and what is a covenant and all the different covenants in the Bible and how they brought clarity to the character of God. Then last week, we talked about the presence of God, the holiness of God, the kingship of God, and justice and righteousness in the Old Testament as four major themes that kind of all wind up weaving together in the end to help us understand more about God's plan of redemption. And so today we want to turn our attention to some of the more glaring arguments against the Old Testament. And in doing this, we're really delving into the arenas of both Old Testament interpretation, which is what we're actually going to be doing, and then really the area of biblical apologetics. And so how do you deal with these objections? How do you address these things? And so let's just contextualize our problem and hear from some of these skeptics. And the first one we're going to hear is from a guy named Richard Dawkins. He's the guy upper left. He's actually the only one of these three that are still alive. He wrote a book called The God Delusion. And he says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. To make matters worse, Dawkins points out the ubiquitous weirdness of the Bible. Many biblical characters engaged in morally scummy acts. This is his language. Here's a sampling. A drunken Lot was seduced by his recently widowed daughters, who eventually bore his children. Abraham gave a repeat performance of lying about his wife. Jephthah made a foolish vow that resulted in his daughter being sacrificed as a burnt offering. David power-raped Bathsheba and engaged in murderous treachery toward her husband Uriah, one of David's loyal, mighty men. Then there's Daniel Dennett, this guy right here. He declares the Old Testament Jehovah is simply a Superman who could take sides in battles and be both jealous and wrathful. He happens to be more forgiving and loving in the New Testament. Dennett adds, part of what makes Jehovah such a fascinating participant in the stories of the Old Testament is his king-like jealousy and pride and his great appetite for praise and sacrifices. And lastly, Christopher Hitchens, focused down here on the bottom left, he says the Old Testament contains a warrant for trafficking in humans, for ethnic cleansing, for slavery, for bride price, and for indiscriminate massacre. But we're not bound by any of it because it was put together by crude, uncultured human animals. He always had a way with words. And the Ten Commandments, he says, are proof that religion is man-made. For one thing, you don't need God to tell you that murder is wrong. This information is available to all humans. And so I'm drawing heavily today on, and you'll see me reference it another time, but a book called Is God a Moral Monster by Christian apologist Paul Copan, who's a really, really well, he does a lot of good writing and arguing for the Christian faith. And so this was one of the things that caused him to write the book with that title is because that's the accusation made by the New Atheist Movement, which these are three of the four horsemen of the New Atheist Movement, Sam Harris being the other one. And so how do we respond to these problematic passages that are all referenced here in these three quotes? We're not going to get to all of the specific texts that they deal with. We're going to deal with the major ones that I've heard in my discussions with other people, and then as I've seen people read through the Bible, ones that they struggle with a good bit. And so we're going to deal with this in two parts. The first part, we're going to get to as many of the ones as we can, and then the last part, the second half, is going to be really dealing predominantly with the conquest of Canaan, right? And that idea of, did God command genocide? Did God command Israel to kill children? All those questions that really are wrapped up in that set of texts there in the Old Testament. So let's talk through a couple of considerations, though, before we jump into the actual passages that we'll study in a second. In terms of dealing with these things from an apologetic standpoint, and even from a leading a discipleship group or teaching the Bible standpoint, it's always helpful. We learn this in hermeneutics, interpreting the Bible. It's always helpful to ask the question: is this passage descriptive or prescriptive? Right. So when it comes to the idea of human trafficking found at the end of the book of Judges, or it comes to that, the thing that was said about Jephthah, who made a vow about sacrificing his daughter if God gave him victory over his enemies, or even Samson for that matter. murdering the Philistines. These are all descriptive passages about how these individuals interacted with the world around them and with the people around them. This is not God's endorsement on their behavior. It's not God saying this is what you all should do. This is what's recommended, or this is what's righteous. And so that's a helpful question to pose when you are struggling with a text, or when somebody else is struggling with a text, is because that descriptive-prescriptive distinction will usually solve a lot of people's understanding about the passage you're dealing with. But it may not always help, because the question then could become, well, then why did God allow that? Right? Why did God allow Jephthah to go through with it? When Abraham clearly didn't. When he kept Abraham from it. Why did God allow this or that to happen? So the descriptive prescriptive thing doesn't always solve the issue, but it does help for people who are genuinely reading the Bible. But then a few other recommendations, and these are rooted in what I did for my doctoral project as far as like essential skills when it comes to conversational apologetics. So the skill of active listening, right? If you think about the human brain and the way that we learn, one of the things about particularly in our day and age with the internet and social media and watching reels, and that's how people learn things. It's a much more incomplete process than it used to be with mentoring, reading books, and the Socratic method, right? And so people, what that means is people have a lot of knowledge gaps that they will say something very assertively that they believe wholeheartedly, but just a few basic skills will actually expose the gaps that they have in their own understanding. And so the first step in that direction is active listening. And what I mean by active listening is genuinely let the person explain as much as they want to, talk as much as they want to about what they believe or about their view of this passage, their objection or argument about why they're skeptical about the scriptures. And then once they're finished, try to summarize their main points and say, I heard you say, and then repeat back to them what they said as best you can. And then say, did I get that right? What this does is, in an apologetic conversation, it allows the person to see that you're not just interested in hearing yourself talk. And it also will enable you to have understanding that they have validated, right? If you can restate their point in your words and they validate it, that's a huge step in the direction of coming to a common ground agreement. Because that's where you ultimately want to get is the next step, which is asking a question. Now, this is Greg Kokel's Tactics or Street Smarts is another book that he's written that follows this method. Is that with everyone that we're going to deal with today, right? After the active listening part of listening to the skeptic's objection, you may find a way to ask a question to start with, right? And famously, the Columbo tactic, as Greg Kokel says in the book Tactics, he says basically the tactic is, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by, and then pick a part of their argument, you know? What do you mean that women were mistreated in the Bible? What do you mean that the Bible condones slavery? Or you know, so like specifically about the passage with Abraham and Isaac, right? Well, you know, God told Abraham to kill Isaac. Oh, really? Okay, so you tell me the story as you best remember it, and let's go through the details together, right? So find a question to ask. It could be even like, well, hey, what's the context of the story, which you'll find is extremely relevant when we get to the command to sacrifice Isaac. Another thing Dwayne and I were talking about the other day, and I think it's helpful in these conversations as far as building common ground, is find the ground that you can give. Find a way to affirm something that they have said. You may not agree with 100% of it, but you may be able to say, you know what, I agree with you that such and such. You know, I agree with you that this, I think you got this right. You know, when you do that, people see that you're not just interested in being right. You know, that you're actually interested in having a conversation. But then remember that every answer that you can give, you have the greatest story ever told to tell, you know. And so, as best as you can, when you answer and you give that answer, tell the story of God's victory over evil, or of Jesus conquering sin. Tell the story of redemption as the context to the story that you're actually addressing. And so those are just a few considerations, a few recommendations for how to engage in these conversations. It's very helpful. So now let's turn to Genesis chapter 6, and let's deal with one that I think will be pretty easy to address as a starting point for us. You may have somebody that's reading the Bible for the first time, or somebody that is, it just doesn't sit well with them, that God could come to the conclusion that destroying the entire human race is the right response to whatever was happening in Noah's day, right? And so that's where we want to start, is divine wrath and the flood. And so somebody read Genesis 6, verses 5 through 7. Somebody read those verses out loud for us.
The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them.
So I think it's helpful to start here is that just think about the description there of the kind of wickedness that was on the earth at the time, right? The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil at the time. Now, it seems like hyperbole, but if we take it at face value, I think it's fair to say that as evil as the world is around us today, there's a restraint that exists in our day and age that things are not as bad as they could be. You know, people, the existence of the church, the existence of just laws and governments, all of these things serve as restraining factors that you didn't have at that period of time. It was purely tribalistic and probably family-oriented society where it was, might makes right kind of atmosphere. And not to mention that you just had the Nephilim, the sons of God issue, which is the larger context. It might be a great place to start here. Well, tell me the larger context of what you understand was happening around the flood. Tell me that story. But it's helpful to say that we cannot fully imagine the extent of wickedness of that day. We probably have never seen anything like that. The evil was great, and every thought of everyone's heart was only evil continually. There was no goodness in the world. Every person was wholly corrupted. There was nothing within them that was not evil. The people of Noah's day were not dabblers in sin. They had taken the plunge, and everything they did was an abomination, save Noah, right? And interestingly, now, if y'all have ever seen the movie Noah, it's not biblical, okay? But one of the things that I think it does have going for it is it actually portrays that Noah was somebody who really struggled. Like and I think it reflects this when he gets off the boat and gets, plants the vineyard, gets drunk. But Noah was, in one sense, like anybody else. He struggled with sin, and yet the Lord chose him because he was the one that was going to be used to be a deliverer in his time. And so the text actually provides some clues as to the extent of evil before the flood. One problem was the rampant violence. Genesis 6:11 says the earth was corrupt in God's sight, was full of violence. The descendants of Cain, the first murderer, were abounding in bloodshed. Another evil among them was occult sexuality. We talked about the Nephilim, the product of the union between fallen angels and human women. The demons who participated in this sin, the 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 says, are currently in chains of darkness reserved for judgment. So obviously some pretty unrestrained and incredible evil in the world at that time. And then the biblical description of pre-flood humanity is that they had become totally hardened and beyond repentance. And things were so bad that the Lord regretted that He had made human beings on earth, and His heart was deeply troubled. And so the flood is a just response to extreme evil. Somebody turn over to Genesis 7, 21 through 23 and read that out loud. Genesis 7, 21 through 23.
And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life, all that was on the dry land died. So He destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive.
Okay, and so Noah is saved, and so what we need to, I think the point that we need to make is taking the text at its word in terms of the extent of the evil that was on the earth. You can't just look over that. And then I think also the role of Noah that God gives, the role that God gives Noah is instructive for us in that He called him to build an ark. And typically the view is just that Noah built the ark, God put the animals on it, Noah took his family, God floods the earth, right? But we're given a little bit more throughout Scripture that really helps us understand part of God's will is that there would be a deliverance available from the wrath, right? The ark was big enough to house more people. And we know that Noah preached, hey, the rain's coming, the rain's coming. And nobody believed him. But God gave little signs over and over that there was this flood coming, even though these people had never experienced that before. This flood was coming, and that they needed to seek deliverance from that flood, from that wrath. And one of the signs that kind of, once again, pictures the mercy of God in the face of His wrath, because God does pour out wrath on sin. That's one of the characteristics. We don't need to apologize for that, right? But there is this opportunity for deliverance. And not only was Noah preaching one of the opportunities, but then you look at the name of Noah's grandfather, right? Noah's grandfather was Methuselah. And the name Methuselah literally translates, when he dies, it will come. And so every time somebody's saying Methuselah's name, hey, something's coming when this guy dies. Something's coming what's Methuselah known for?
969 years.
The oldest man ever recorded in Scripture. So is God quick to wrath, or is God long-suffering in His mercy? I think that's something that is overlooked by people who would object, would throw up this objection about God's wrath and the flood. Okay? Simple answer. That's probably the simplest one we're going to have. And so let's move on to a difficult one, right? Abraham and Isaac. Okay, once again, leaning heavily on Paul Copan here. So throughout the narrative, it's important to recognize that God used Abraham as a picture of trust. He wasn't perfect, but God used him as a picture of trust. Abraham had left his home in Ur and given up his past for the sake of God's promise. Now, in this moment, he was being asked if he would trust God by apparently surrendering his future as well. So don't miss that connection. The call to leave Ur was Abraham being called to give up his past for the sake of God's promise. Now, if you take the whole arc of the story up to this point, when he has Isaac on the altar, and there's more to this, but in just the command, when he has Isaac on the altar, God's asking him if he would trust him by surrendering his future as well. Everything Abraham had ever hoped for was tied up in his son, a promise. Now, without God's promise, Abraham would have been wrong to do some of the things that he had done. Remember, God gave him that promise, and his and Sarah's initial response to the promise was to try and solve the problem of their age and Sarah's barrenness. And so Sarah recommended or suggested that Abraham would sleep with Hagar, and who was Sarah's servant. And the product of that union was Ishmael, right? And so Abraham loved Ishmael, but there was contention between Sarah and Hagar. And so on at least two different occasions, Hagar and Ishmael, they're considered to be sent away by Abraham, or by Abram, even though he had begged God, that Ishmael might live before you, okay? And so Abraham decides to send Hagar and Ishmael away, almost to certain death. But God came near to Abraham and promised him that he would become a great nation, that despite Sarah's anger at Hagar and Ishmael, God would provide for Ishmael, and that Abraham need not worry that he was doing wrong. God would actually care for them and fulfill his promises to them. So Abraham, in Genesis 21:14, Abraham rose early in the morning, just as he would eventually do with Isaac in the next chapter, and sent them both away. So think about this. Abraham loved Ishmael. Abraham's an example of faith. Abraham gave up his past, and now in the present, God is calling him, not just in Genesis 22 to give up his future hope, right, or surrender his future hope. He's doing the same thing with Ishmael in Genesis 21. Ishmael was a preliminary test. Would Abraham obey and send them away, trusting in God's promise that he would make him a great nation? Abraham was faithful. But now you got Isaac. Isaac would bring an even greater test. Abraham knew that God would fulfill his promise regarding Isaac, but he didn't know what God would do in the end. All he could do was trust God's promise and obey. Somehow God had to come through, and Abraham's obedience, we now see, was carried out in the context of his awareness of God's earlier deliverance of Ishmael and God's act of providing the miracle child of promise through Sarah. We get it in Genesis 12, in Hebrews 12, right? Or it's Hebrews 12 or Romans 4, that Abraham was going to go through with it because he believed that God could raise him from the dead. And so Abraham had this faith, and in Genesis 19 we get, Genesis 22, we get this story. So let's look at Genesis 22. So we're going to see some interesting things about this, okay? So let's start with verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham. After these things, meaning after another interaction with Abimelech, and them sending Hagar and Ishmael away. So after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I should tell you." Okay, so I want you to think about or observe there what's unique about God's language, what God actually says, and specifically in verse 2.
He calls Isaac his only son.
Yep. Whom you love. So we're immediately tipped off to the fact that God's testing Abraham, and that God, in the test, I think it's important that in that first verse, the idea of a test is that God never intends for Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, right? That test is meaning that this is something that Abraham is going to experience a proving of his faith, but not actually go through with it. But I think the stronger argument that strengthens verse 1, or the argument from verse 1, is what y'all just said in the second. The hard command to Abraham is cushioned by God's tenderness. God's directive is unusual. Please take your son. It's almost the language in the Hebrew actually could be like, take, I beg of you, your only son. God displays a remarkable gentleness as he gives this difficult order. A third indication of God's good character highlights his faithfulness. God reminded Abraham of your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Okay, so these are so far we've seen three things that indicate that there's more to the story here than just God telling Abraham to go kill Isaac. It's a test. Secondly, there's a gentleness on the part of God, and then there's a faithfulness in the language that God uses, because God's the one who's given him this son. Ishmael was the son of the flesh, right? Mm-hmm. Hagar and Abraham produced that on their own, and then Sarah's decision. But Isaac, that's why he calls him your only son. Isaac is the son that God gave him. Okay, but there's something else. There's a fourth thing. Now, this, once again, do y'all have any kind of footnote about Moriah? About the word in your Bibles?
Mine just says traditionally associated with Jerusalem and the site on which Solomon's temple would be built later.
Okay. So Moriah is derived from the Hebrew word ra'ah, which means to provide or see or show. So read it that way. Go to the land of my provision. Go to the land where you will see something. Go to the land where I will show you something, and offer him there as a burnt offering. And so, in all these ways, we see the faithful tenderness of God cushioning this startling harshness of God's command. It's as though God is saying to Abraham, I'm testing your obedience and allegiance. You don't understand, but in light of all you've done and said, in light of all I've done and said to you, trust me, not even death can nullify the promise I've made. It really is a distinction there. This is the son that God's provided. Why would God call Abraham to kill him, right? If this is the son that God's provided. It's all a test. And so God is testing Abraham to prove his faith. God is gentle in his command. He's told to go to the land of provision. He's reminded that God's the one who gave him this child. And so in all of that, we see, and I guess this is part of this, we don't like the command, right? But ultimately, let's go back to that last point we said earlier about contextualize the story. We know that on this same mountain, right? Because you said Moriah was related to Jerusalem. That in this same area, God would provide. And he would provide by doing what? By offering up his own son. But whereas Abraham kept Isaac, God did not shield Jesus from death. And yet, just as Abraham knew that God could raise Isaac from the dead, it was God's will that Jesus be raised from the dead so that we could have life in him. And so, this is what we would, I think this is helpful to point people to when they're reading the Bible. This is what we call a prototype or an archetype. This is setting up something in the reader's mind that they're going to need to remember later on. It's a common rhetorical device. And so I think in all of those ways, we can at least give people a pause at being so skeptical about this just by studying the passage, okay? All right, let's go to another one. That's probably the last one we're going to get to in this section. It's a big one. So let's talk about the issue of slavery in the Old Testament. Issue of slavery in the Old Testament. Let's go to Exodus chapter 21. And then we'll also be in Leviticus chapter 25. So slavery in the Bible is a difficult topic to broach because our paradigm is both horrific and largely unrelated to slavery in the Bible. So when we talk about the paradigm, we're talking about the way that people look at slavery. They hear the word slavery and they're immediately triggered to think of something specific. And the something specific that they think of is the idea of chattel slavery. Okay, so chattel slavery is where individuals are tricked into or forced to work, and they receive no pay and have no right to refuse the work. So obviously, we're all familiar with the British slave trade or the American slave trade, where ships went to Africa and kidnapped people off their property or told them that they would be going to a certain place, and then they were sold into slavery on plantations in the South and really all over the United States. And so we're familiar with that. I think it's a helpful balance, even though for a lot of people it seems like you're trying to change the point, is that slaves have existed all throughout human history. And the chattel slavery model was not just limited to white colonialists. Mandy and I had an opportunity to go to an island called Zanzibar, which is off the coast of East Africa, and it was if you think about some islands in the Caribbean where the slave traders would stop off before they got to America, right? This island on the other side of Africa was that island for the African slave trade for India and for the Middle East. And so we went into actual holding cells that slaves were in. We saw and touched actual chains that held slaves, and got on a slave boat and saw where they would pack these like 200 people in this small space. I mean, it was awful. And this was all done by Arab slave traders, right? Who used to take the slaves back up the coast of Africa into the Middle East. And so it's when people bring up this idea of slavery in the Bible, I think that's a helpful starting point, right? So maybe a way to rephrase that as a question is, well, tell me your understanding of and significance of slavery in human history. And once again, let them answer that question. But slavery in the Old Testament was very different and involved a variety of methods and situations and restrictions. But the Old Testament is very clear about one thing that is immediately relevant to where we are today. And so let's look at this in Exodus chapter 21. And so we just talked about the context of chattel slavery, right? And so look at Exodus chapter 21, verse 16. So somebody read that out loud. Exodus chapter 21, verse 16.
He that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death.
So what is God's prescription for Israel if they find somebody engaging in the chattel slavery system that we just described happened all over the world in the 1700s, 1800s? Capital punishment, right? And so just from here, right? Okay, does God condone slavery as we are familiar with it? No. In fact, it deserves the worst form of punishment that is possible, right? That's That's an interest. I mean, that's a really good rebuttal if you want to think of it that way. Okay, but let's deal with what the slavery in the Bible actually was now. So I think it's a helpful point to make that in an ideal world, slavery would neither be an option or necessary. Because of the socioeconomic situation in the Old Testament Israel, God did allow slavery, but he allowed it for a simple purpose, to help the poor survive. A person could sell himself into slavery, which is akin to indentured servitude, in order to pay off a debt or provide basic subsistence. God did not intend for Israel to have poverty, according to Deuteronomy 15:4, but sin made it inevitable, according to Deuteronomy 15:5. And God allowed slavery to deal with that reality. God also enacted several laws to prevent the need for slavery in the first place. And many of these are found in Deuteronomy chapter 24. So let's go there. Deuteronomy chapter 24. Okay, so look specifically at verse 14. Deuteronomy 24:14. You shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land or within your towns. You shall give him his wages on the same day before the sun sets, for he is poor and counts on it, lest he cry against you to the Lord and you be guilty of sin. Go down now to verse 17. You shall not pervert the justice due to the sojourner or to the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge, but you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this. So this continually comes up in God's dealing with Israel. He reminds them that he redeemed them from slavery. And so that should clarify how they're meant to interact with those who are less fortunate than them, who are the poor, or are slaves in their society. Look at verse 19. When you reap your harvest in the field and you forget a sheaf in the field, you should not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Remember, the point of this is that these were people who would have to go into slavery because they had no money to provide food for themselves or to get things that they needed. And so God is building in mercy into the law, into the way that Israel is supposed to operate, so that these people don't have to go into slavery. That was not his desire or his design. But where people did have to go into slavery, God was very specific on how they were to be treated. And so just in summary, the treatment God prescribed for slaves reflects his concern for the foreigner and the poor. In the case of debt slaves, foreign women and girls, slaves lived with the family. They did domestic chores and sometimes held responsible, trusted positions, according to Genesis 24. Laws that, at first glance, seem to be abusive actually mirror civil law regarding free men. If either a free man or a slave is injured, the one who caused injury must provide care for the victim. We see this in Exodus chapter 21. There's guidance for both. So it says if this happens, if you cause injury to a free man, then you must provide care. If you cause injury to a slave, you must provide care. Chattel slavery treated these people as a non-human, right? The slavery that we talked about earlier in America and Britain and all throughout the world. But the slavery that God was addressing here actually treated these people as human beings and provided justice for them. Exodus 21, 26 and 27, if a man harms his slave's face, the slave is free. A fair comparison to the injury of a free man, which is stated in the few verses before in Exodus 21. If an ox killed a free man, it was meant to be stoned and given the punishment of a murderer. If an ox killed a slave, same punishment. So they're on equal ground. So it's not the chattel slavery system, and in fact, God is elevating their position, which would have been such a drastic shift from any one of the surrounding nations and the kind of ways that they engaged with slavery in that time. God also provided in the law opportunities for freedom. And so one of the biggest differences between modern chattel slavery and the Old Testament slavery was that no Israelite had to be a lifetime slave. Debt slavery always came with an expiration date. Back here in Exodus 21, a Hebrew slave was to go free after 6 years, and they would leave with generous support, according to Deuteronomy 15:14. Let's look at that one. Deuteronomy 15:14, just a couple of chapters earlier. And so this is starting in verse 12. So this is once again the second giving of the law to the new generation. So Moses is retelling the law to this generation that's about to go into the promised land. And so start in verse 12. If your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. And once again, look at where he roots it in. Verse 15. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this day. But if he says to you, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he is well off with you, then you shall take an awl and put it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your slave forever. So the only way that forever slavery existed was when the environment was so good, because that guy was a member of the family, right, that he says, I'm better off with you. I don't want to go anywhere. This is not apples to apples slavery, right? There's justice here, there's equity here, there's love here, even as it says there. And even if they were to go free, they went with a bounty. Leviticus 25:40 says a Hebrew slave was to go free at the year of Jubilee, right? Not only was it every 7th year or after 7 years, then if it hit every, I think, 50 years in the year of Jubilee, so even if they'd had to go into debt and go into slavery 1 year, if the year of Jubilee came the next year, then they would get set free and their debts would be wiped clean. Any foreign slave who escaped to Israel was to be sheltered and not returned to slavery, according to Deuteronomy 23. Now, there's nothing in the Old Testament law that prohibits an Israelite slave from running away. Slavery was advantageous for the poor, and apparently if they thought they could do better elsewhere, they could leave. If, however, the debt was not fulfilled, the slave could be apprehended and sold like any other debtor. And, you know, depending on your view of major credit card companies, that may still happen today, right? Foreign slaves were not automatically released after 6 years. Foreigners were not allowed to own land in Israel, and it would have been next to impossible for them to earn a living on their own. So to release such slaves against their will may have been cruel, because you were basically consigning them to a life of poverty and potentially death. And so, in summary, God's allowance for slavery in the Old Testament was a drastic shift from the surrounding nations in the Old Testament. I think it's always helpful to emphasize that God is dealing with the Israelites and the people that he's speaking to in their moment in time. Slavery exists all over the world, and so God says, I'm going to take this people and we're going to make slavery something that eventually slavery will be done away by this line of people, namely Christians, because of the principles of justice and equity and fairness and freedom that I have instilled in them, right? And so it improves the situation for people in the law. It provides opportunities for their freedom, and it's a far cry from the chattel slavery. That I think another helpful point is that it's still around, right? I mean, there are. Today's the Super Bowl, right? So one of the highest days for prostitution and sex trafficking in the world it will be in New Orleans today, because they ship in high-end prostitutes and bring in all kinds of individuals who will be sold for sex today. And so chattel slavery still very much exists in the world today. Okay, so y'all got any questions about slavery, the binding of Isaac, or God's wrath and the flood?
I could just, when you said the whole, where they love you, you can keep them, I can hear the antagonist saying, oh yeah, that's Stockholm Syndrome. We see kidnappers today that would fall in love with their kidnapper.
Yeah.
True love, but
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that would be a skeptic's response for sure. But in terms of just taking the text as a whole, it's really hard to argue against the kind of accommodations and laws that were in favor of giving the kind of slaves that the Bible's talking about a life that they could not have achieved otherwise.
and for the most part, people don't take the whole time to read the whole picture.
Right.
Oh, they're worse about that.
Yeah, just piecemeal, proof text, quote. Yeah, for sure.
And I tell you what, to be honest with you though, Christians are just as bad at it when they go to talk to people about their beliefs.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Like will accuse them of what they believe
yeah.
without asking a question.
That's yeah.
Because most of the time when I talk to people, I try to use the Greg Kokel.
Yeah.
I want to hear from their mouth, and I'll tell them that. I've read that y'all believe this, this, and this.
Yeah.
But this is the reason I want to know. Do you believe that?
Right.
And then by the end of the conversation, usually we don't agree, but they'll thank you.
Yeah,
They'll
for sure.
Thank you. They'll say, "Hey, we appreciate you taking the time, showing interest, and not just assuming what I believe, but wanting to know what I believe."
That matters. It matters if you're actually trying to win somebody, and have an opportunity to share the gospel with them versus just have an argument. That's what it took me years to learn. And so, all right, let's take 10 minutes, come back at 2:34, and we'll deal, like I said, in the second half, be a good bit longer, we'll deal with the conquest of Canaan and genocide and the issues related to that. All right.
Well, if they don't believe in it, and they don't believe it anymore, and not taught it, what are they afraid of?
That's crazy.
But then when, here's the way, I've seen some interviews where they're like, did you sell your soul to the devil? The interviewer will ask them, did you sell your soul to the devil? Some of them will straight up say yes. Some of them will be like, we'll talk about that.
Yeah, right. Wow.
Oh, wow.
And they think that they'll go to hell and escape God, but he's the God of hell too.
Yep.
Like Satan won't be down there ruling. He'll just be
Yeah.
one of the people in suffering.
Yeah, it's his presence. He's transcendent. Or no, that would be he's omnipresent. So he's even there. But it's what attributes is he withholding in that place that makes it hell? You know.
Well, going back to the character of his character in the Bible, just seeing how loving and gracious and caring and forgiving he is, just the absence of that, which is
Right.
could be a form of hell, just the absence of his love
Yeah.
for eternity. That's scary.
That is.
He is full wrath for eternity.
Right.
I made a statement such a it's not gonna be so bad, the prison will be there. I said, let me ask you a question. Let me take your hand and put it on a hot stove. If I put your hand on a hot stove, you can worry about whether I'm here or not?
On Cheryl's desk.
Or it could, you know, they're different.
You know those Agape journals?
There are different forms of hell mentioned in the Bible.
If there are, they're in where Misty's meeting. But there's some of the women's journals that are when you walk into the workroom, the very top cabinet. Hey, if you just walk straight in the top cabinet.
It's scary to me. I'm just like, oh no.
All right, let's deal with the conquest of Canaan, and this idea or this accusation that did God command genocide, or is it divine justice? And so when we talk about the Canaanites, we're talking about a group of people groups, right? So you're talking about the Midianites, the Moabites, the Amalekites, and a number of other Jebusites, Girgashites. I mean, there's all kinds of the people groups there in the land of Canaan. And so Paul Copan, once again, he does a great job of disarming some of the teeth of this argument when a skeptic would say, why did God command Israel to commit genocide or to do the things that he commanded them to do to the people of Canaan? And in their question, they make it sound like that the people of Canaan are peace-loving, innocent individuals. And so I think a helpful question, just going along with starting with a question, would be, well, what exactly did God command them to do? Which one are you talking about? Help me understand. Let's narrow in on a passage. So try to get them to focus in. Another helpful question to ask would be, well, tell me, what do you know about the Canaanites? And try to get some clarification there, because once again, Paul Copan says that the Canaanites were full of some very specific types of wickedness. I'm going to read an extended portion here. He says, what kind of wickedness are we talking about? We're familiar with the line, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. In the case of the Canaanites' moral apples didn't fall far from the tree of their pantheon of immoral gods and goddesses. So if the Canaanite deities engaged in incest, then it's not surprising that incest wasn't treated as a serious moral wrong among the Canaanite people. As we've seen, adultery, temple sex, bestiality, homosexual acts, also temple sex, and child sacrifice were also permitted. Humans, he says, are imaging beings designed to reflect the likeness and glory of their Creator. If we worship the creaturely rather than the Creator, we'll come to resemble or image the idols of our own devising and that in which we place our security. the sexual acts of the gods and goddesses were imitated by the Canaanites as a kind of magical act. The more sex on Canaanite high places, the more this would stimulate the fertility god Baal to have sex with his consort Anath, which meant more semen, or rain. That's what they called the rain. They believed it was semen that it was produced there to water the earth. Israel had no inherent, and so he talks about how how these are the people that God called Israel to engage, to drive out, to pour out His judgment upon for these acts of idolatry, for these acts of immorality and objectification of people who were weak. And so another objection that's often thrown up is to say, well, I bet you're somebody might say, well, I bet you're in favor of Israel possessing the land that they're on now, but that land was somebody else's in the first place, and they have no inherent right to that land. This is one of those places that you can actually give a little bit of ground when it comes to the Joshua and the land of Canaan, right? Is to say, yeah, you're right. Israel had no inherent right to inhabit the land. It was an undeserved gift from God. And neither did the Canaanites have a right to remain in it. In fact, both the Canaanites and the Israelites would experience partial removal from the land because of their wickedness. So God used the Israelites to judge the Canaanites, and then He turned around and used other sinful nations to judge the Israelites. And the same thing happened to them. And it's interesting how that thread follows through the entire, from the entrance to the land of Canaan, then to the prophets when you see them removed. A lot of people might also say, well, this is what inspired the things like the Crusades and the Inquisition and the Salem witch trials, is that there's this idea that God calls His people to be at war with all those that are opposed to God. I think it's helpful to say these commands were for Israel in a specific time, in a specific place. When you balance these commands with the rest of Scripture, it's pretty clear that it's not the individual believer or a family who's meant to take vengeance on anybody. Romans 13 would say that that's the government's responsibility, that they hold the power of the sword, that we, as believers, have been given the job of loving God and loving people and preaching the gospel. And so that is our occupation. So I think it's easy to disarm that it's this call to war for all the followers of God. Now, if you want a great example of what that actually would look like, then we call that Islamic jihad. Right? That's war against all those who are not following Allah. But there were special exceptions that were made for Canaanites. It was not a blanket kill all the Canaanites, because consider Rahab and her family in Joshua chapter 2. Though they were immersed in the Canaanite culture, they proved to be a clear sign that other Canaanites could potentially have been rescued as well. And another example of that, which was the object of an awful pun this morning, was Ruth, right? Mm-hmm. Ruth was a Moabitess. She was of the tribe of Moab and became a part of the people of Israel. Some people say that these commands in Deuteronomy and Joshua and 1 Samuel, which we'll read in a second, that they commend racism, right? They commend racism. But this is another place where we get to tell the story. Genesis chapter 12. God calls Abraham to follow Him because through Abraham, all the nations, all the families of the earth would be blessed. God's purpose from the very outset is to restore that blessing to all the people of Canaan. In fact, what they're doing shows how distant they are and how much sin has infected them, how distant they are from God and how much sin has infected them. And so God, as a holy and righteous judge, is going to pour out wrath on that sin. And so we're not off to a very xenophobic start if we just deal with Genesis chapter 12. Furthermore, God also repeatedly commanded Israel to show concern for non-Israelite aliens or sojourners in their midst. We read a few of those passages earlier. And the whole idea was because Israelites had been strangers in Egypt. God frequently reminded His people to learn the lessons of their history so that they wouldn't be doomed to repeat it with Gentiles in their midst. Furthermore, according to Israel's civil law, the stranger living in Israel had the same legal rights as a native Israelite. Leviticus 24:22 says, "There shall be one standard for you. It shall be one for the stranger as well as the native, for I am the Lord your God." Instead of hostility, God commanded the Israelites to love and show concern for the resident aliens in their midst. The command to love the resident alien and to treat her the same way as a citizen, according to Leviticus 19:33 and 34, is remarkable and is totally unique in the ancient Near East religious thoughts and practices. And so I think it's really helpful here to deal with from the outset too, is that God was concerned with sin, not the ethnicity. God is concerned with sin, not the ethnicity. We mentioned already that God used Israel to judge unrighteous nations, and God used other unrighteous nations to judge Israel. So let's deal with a few of these passages. So there's three of them. So Mr. Carl, why don't you look up Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, Dwayne, Joshua 6:21, and then Tracy, 1 Samuel 15, verse 3. Deuteronomy 7, verses 1 and 2. And so read all of verse, all the way through verse 2 there. Find it. Will you read it out loud, Mr. Carl?
When the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land where you go to possess it, and hath cast out many nations before thee, the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. When the Lord thy God shall deliver them before thee, thou shalt smite them, utterly destroy them, and thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughters thou shalt not give to his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. For they will turn away thy son from following me, and that they may serve other gods.
All right, stop right there. All right, so if somebody brings this passage up to you as a way to say, look, God commanded genocide against all these nations, what would be a question that you could ask or a way that you could respond that's rooted in the text, in the right interpretation of the text, that shows that there's something happening here in the way they're understanding the passage that's not accurate?
Verse 4 tells you.
Yeah, well, it tells you why, right? Why God's telling them to do this. But what's verse 2 telling them to do?
Smite them, utterly destroy them, make no covenant with them, nor show mercy unto them.
Okay, so my translation says, you must devote them to complete destruction. Mm-hmm. Devote them to complete destruction. Okay, so when we think, when we hear that, we think genocide, right? God's telling them to kill everybody, kill the entire group of people. But how can you still have intermarriage between sons and daughters if they kill everybody? So something's happening here.
They're concerned that we'll still know the customs of their fathers, which God is trying to destroy.
That's not a bad take, but I think there's even something more here, okay? And I think Dwayne's going to clear it up, or he's going to help us see it in Joshua chapter 6, maybe. Let's see, Joshua chapter 6, okay. So what actually happened, Dwayne?
And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, all the edge of the sword.
Whoa there. All right, so it sounds like that they killed everybody, right? Well, yeah, I mean, they killed they killed everything, right? Okay, so remember when we talked about in hermeneutics, right? The the genre of literature and the context of the passage matters, okay? So just track with me on this, because I think this is helpful. So this Paul Copan, he says, like his ancient Near Eastern contemporaries, Joshua used the language of conventional warfare rhetoric. This language sounds like bragging and exaggeration to our ears. Notice the first sweeping language, he's going to quote Joshua chapter 10, verse 40. Thus Joshua struck all the land, the hill country and the Negev, and the lowland and the slopes and all their kings. He left no survivor, but he utterly destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. So Joshua, Copan says, according to the kind of passage that this is, used the rhetorical bravado language of his day, asserting that all the land was captured, all the kings defeated, and all the Canaanites destroyed. Yet, as we will see, Joshua himself acknowledged that this wasn't literally so. Now, some people might say that this is Joshua being misleading or of getting it wrong, but not at all. He was speaking the language that everyone in his day would have understood. Rather than trying to deceive, Joshua was saying that he had fairly well trounced the enemy. Just as we might say that a sports team blew their opponents away or slaughtered and annihilated them. The author or editor likewise followed the rhetoric of his day. So in Deuteronomy chapter 7 that Mr. Carl just read, we find a similar tension. On the one hand, God tells Israel that they should defeat and utterly destroy the Canaanites, a holy consecration to destruction. On the other hand, he immediately goes on to say in the very next verse, furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them and do all the other things, right? And Mr. Carl was right about they were supposed to tear down the Asherim, which were figures of Asherah, who's the Canaanite goddess of sexuality or sensuality, and burn their images with fire. So if the Canaanites were to be completely obliterated, why is the discussion about intermarriage or treaties? The point of the passage is to destroy any semblance of their religious identity, because God knew that would actually cause them to stray. Okay, let's go to one more. Let's go to 1 Samuel 15:3. I think this is one that's going to come up later, but go ahead and read it for us, Tracy.
Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey.
Okay, so similar language. This one now is related to Saul and his conquests, and so this idea of Saul utterly destroying the Amalekites. So when we read phrases like the destruction of everything that breathes, we should be guarded. In fact, for all we know, and based on what we saw in Joshua, what we'll see below, Saul could have well been engaging combatants in battle rather than non-combatants. So one thing I didn't mention, but is very relevant to the prior passages. So when Joshua and them are coming into the land, right, you read about Jericho and about Ai, right, these two cities that were major victories for Israel when Joshua and the Israelites were coming into the Promised Land. When we hear about these cities, we think about maybe you picture some kind of medieval castle wall with people on the inside, and shepherds and sheep and families and little kids running around playing by the pigs. And I mean, you think of a fully functioning society. What you don't get from these passages is that archaeologists and historians believe that these were largely military outposts. I think we said in another class, that one of the themes of the Exodus is God continuing to break the power of Egypt, because the Promised Land had all these defensive outposts for Egypt that were run by these other people groups. And so God's continuing to break the power of Egypt as they go into the Promised Land, and they go and attack these places that were largely fortified with combatants. They were fortified with armies. There were probably not the non-combatants there. And as an example of this, so think about they had a fortified city, but they were largely people who lived in tents and other things around in the hills. And so as they go and attack this Jericho, or as they go attack Ai, the families of the soldiers that are in that fort, essentially, are living elsewhere. Joshua and them did not pursue them into the hills, right? They conquered that place. They conquered the fort, right? And so that's another helpful point that we don't always get just from a surface reading of the text. And so that's largely one of the things that could be at play here in 1 Samuel chapter 15 is that they're engaging in battle with combatants rather than non-combatants. So the city of Amalek in 1 Samuel 15:5 was probably a fortified, perhaps semi-permanent military encampment. And so decisive defeat is certainly in view. They killed everything. But the fact that there's mention of women and children and all these other kinds of things does not necessarily actually mean that those women and children, there were actually women and children were there. It's an idiom, it's hyperbole to say that they devoted everything to destruction. And this sounds like it's trying to be a red herring to distract from what the text actually says. But this is where hermeneutics comes into play. You can't read the text without understanding the genre of literature and the kind of context that was surrounding the way this is being written, because it's written in a specific time and a specific place. And so once again, let's deal with the specific language that God commanded Israel when they come to Jericho and Ai. And so we'll read a little bit more about this. So did God command Israel to kill the children? And so Joshua's language concerning Jericho and Ai appears harsh at first glance. So Joshua 6:21, they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with sword every living thing, men and women, young and old, cattle and sheep and donkeys. 12,000 men and women fell that day, which is just a collective noun, a way of saying all the people of Ai. The average person isn't going to pick up on the fact that this stereotypical ancient Near Eastern language actually describes attacks on military forts or garrisons, not general populations that included women and children. There's no archaeological evidence of civilian populations at Jericho or Ai. Second, a number of battles Israel fought on the way to and within Canaan were defensive battles. They were not offensive attacks. The Amalekites attacked traveling Israelites in Exodus 17:8. The Canaanite king of Arad attacked and captured some Israelites in Numbers 21. The Amorite king Sihon refused Israel's peaceful overtures and attacked instead in Numbers 21 and in Deuteronomy 2. Bashan's king Og came out to meet Israel in battle, Numbers 21, Deuteronomy 3. Israel responded to Midian's calculated attempts to lead Israel astray through idolatry and immorality in Numbers 31. 5 kings attacked Gibeon, which Joshua defended. Now, Gibeon, remember, is not an Israelite tribe, but they came and made a treaty under deception, right, with Israel, and Joshua honored that peace pact with the Gibeonites and defended Gibeon against the 5 kings in Joshua chapter 10, verse 4. But Copan actually deals with the question that I think is helpful. And what I'm going to do instead of, because I didn't have a handout for y'all because this is so extensive, there's a lot of quotes, I'm just going to have a link to my notes on the app. So if y'all ever need to go back and reference all these quotes, they're all in there, okay? But this is interesting. It's interesting train of thought. He says, if infants are killed by God's command, they aren't wronged, for they will be compensated by God in the next life. So why not support infanticide, Copan says. Why not kill all infants to make sure that they're with God in the hereafter? This question, commonly raised by critics, doesn't follow, of course, for at least 4 reasons. First, in the context of God's ongoing special revelation to Israel, God gave an unrepeatable command for a specific purpose, which the Scriptures themselves make clear. This command to make war against these specific places is not to be universalized. Secondly, since life belongs to God, any harm caused due to specific purposes in a specific context would be overshadowed by divine benefits in the afterlife. Third, while the infant would go to God's presence, the killer has not only taken another's life, but also sinned primarily against God, according to Psalm 51. And then 4, the killer is responsible for the consequences of his own actions, namely taking innocent life. He is not responsible for granting heavenly life. The giver of heavenly benefit cannot be the human agent, but only God himself, another agent. And so these are 4 reasons why it doesn't follow that we should support infanticide just because this language exists in the book of Joshua. Okay, so we're almost to the end here. But so we've dealt with the reality of defensive battles. We've dealt with the reality of combatants versus non-combatants. Another thing that is not in my notes that I didn't mention that I read is that it's helpful when you get to the book of Esther, right? So the king of the Amalekites, Agag, right, that Saul refused to kill and that Samuel followed through and killed. So when you get to the book of Esther, who's the enemy in Esther? Haman the Agagite. He is in the line of King Agag the Amalekite, who was killed by Israelites. So once again, if Saul had devoted all of them to destruction, how is Haman in existence? All right, so it's not, once again, this is language that was used in this context that's rhetoric. It's not meant to be taken literally, okay? But one of the things that I think is very helpful for us and helps us tell the story is to really pick up on this idea of we'll call it Israelite evangelization, right? You have the preservation of Rahab and her family. And it indicates that this consecration ban, devote them all to destruction, wasn't absolute and irreversible. Just like we saw with Noah, just like we see with Jonah, right? There are warnings to flee from the wrath to come. God had given ample indications of his power and his greatness, and the Canaanites could have submitted to the one true God who trumped Egypt's and Canaan's gods, sparing their own lives. And I think because of the nature of the narrative here, there's probably a lot more like that happened that we don't get, that wasn't recorded or wasn't preserved, at least for us. God's overarching goal was to bring blessing and salvation to the nations, right? And they were supposed to offer peace to the people who were supposed to offer peace to those who would turn away, like Rahab. And this is actually codified in the law in Exodus chapter 12, verses 48 and 49. It says, if a stranger sojourns with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. Again, in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 3 through 8, while some nations, like the Ammonites and Moabites, were restricted from full participation in Israel's assembly, others, such as the Edomites or the Egyptians, were permitted after a few generations. And this picks up on what Mr. Carl mentioned earlier about the remembrance of the religious ceremony. So it's not about ethnicity, it's about sin. It's about the temptation to idolatry. And then we've already mentioned Rahab and Ruth. And so God's overarching goal is to bring blessing and salvation to the nations, including the Canaanites through Abraham. The covenant God made with Abraham is unique in its sweeping, outsider-oriented, universally directed nature. It is unlike any other ancient religious movement. Yet, for a specific, relatively short and strategic period, God sought to establish Israel in the land with a view to fulfilling His long-term, global, indeed cosmic plan of redemption. God would simultaneously punish a wicked people ripe for judgment. Not doing so would have erased humankind's only hope for redemption. And so, all of these, I mean, this is a long and complex argument with lots of factors, lots of different angles that people might bring to it. But the fact of the matter is that there is an answer to the question, right? And once again, the idea of genocide, you can tell such a phenomenal story that one day every tribe and tongue and nation will be worshiping before the throne, and so I think that's the story we should tell. A lot of these, and we'll talk about it more when we get to apologetics, which will be in the spring after we do New Testament. A lot of these arguments are what we would call straw man arguments, right? It's low-hanging fruit. It's easy pickings for people who are skeptical of Christianity, that they feel like if we can just make this point, we can show that the God that Christians say that they worship, they don't actually know. And going back to something that you said earlier, Dwayne, is that so many Christians, they've never been exposed to their own knowledge gaps, right? So I was telling the students this morning that as we talked about doubt this morning, and I told them, I was like, doubt is a feature and not a bug of being a human being. And we talked about, making sure they understood feature, not a bug, that phrase. And I said, so here's the cool thing, is that you're in an environment, you're in a context where we want you to explore the gaps that you have in your knowledge about Jesus, about who God is, about who you are, about who God says that you are. We want you to explore all those things, and then where you have questions, we want you to ask those questions. Because asking those questions reveals a teachableness and a vulnerability, and we talked about who, to entrust with that vulnerability, right? It's a big issue. But I was like, asking those questions is actually going to lead you to have a faith that you actually own yourself. And that's the goal, right? And so I think that's important to recognize as we get further into New Testament apologetics, the biblical worldview that we'll start in a few weeks, is that this whole process, this adventure that we're on, is about us having a holistic, well-formed faith that actually wrestles with the questions that we have, the problem passages of Scripture like we've talked about today, that seeks to understand and comprehend the entirety of God's Word. Just these past few weeks, you can really tell how so many Christians live with just this ambiguity about Leviticus and Exodus and Numbers and the specifics contained within, because as we're just telling the story and kind of shrinking it down for everybody to understand, they're like, it's things that I've learned or I've heard all my life are becoming clear to me about why this is there, right? And so what we're doing in there is really the main goal of everything that we do, is to make it to where people can grasp and comprehend the beauty of God's plan and the glory of His character and the incredible calling and privilege that we have to be His children. And being a disciple means wrestling with passages, just like we talked about today. And then as we go forward with apologetics, being able to give an answer and articulate these things and engage in conversation about them. And that's ultimately the kind of disciples that we want to raise up out of here. And so any questions about these, anything that we've talked about today, or anything related to the passages with Canaan and the conquest of Canaan, or anything like that?
When I go to your notes, what do I look up? You said you got a link to the app. When I get into the app, where,
That's a good question, Mr. Carl. So when you get into the app,
Conquest of Canaan, is that what it is?
so I'll have, I'll cut the live stream off and I'll show you, because that's a good question. But I'll have to show you on your, do you have the app on your phone? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll show you on the app on your phone. All right. So we'll be done. Thank you all for doing this with me, engaging in the